Now, we're truly honoured to have Craig Mokhiber deliver the opening address. And we're going to cross to Craig in New York. But first of all, I'd just like to say a few things about Craig, and I'm sure all of you here are very aware of Craig and his work. But he, having been the former head of the New York office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in New York, this was one of the many senior roles he's had at the UN and elsewhere over a 4 decades long career to date. As an international lawyer, as an expert in the field of human rights law and policy. Craig's substantial work across many countries gives him a rich perspective on humanity and the intersection of human rights with democracy and the rule of law. His work has contributed to moving us towards a more just and humane world where all people are accorded fundamental rights and dignity. That work has also enabled him to see clearly the forces at work attempting to maintain a world order that benefits the few. In recent times, he's called out the failure of the international community, and in particular, Western democracies that have enabled and continue to enable the ethnic cleansing and genocide of the Palestinian people. We're honoured to have him deliver our opening address, and he joins us from New York. Craig Mokhiber, welcome.
Yes, thank you very much. You made me jealous with that weather report. I have to say we are still in midwinter here in the northeast of the United States, but it is such a great honor to be with all of you today. I want to thank you, Chair, and also my thanks to the organizers, and my thanks and solidarity to the family of Julian Assange. And to Julian, thank you on behalf of the countless people working in the global human rights movement who have relied on your work to strengthen our own and for the inspiration that you provided as well. Let me begin, as you often do in Australia, by honoring the traditional stewards of the land from which I am speaking, who were displaced and dispossessed by successive waves of French, British, and American settler colonialism across the Niagara region. These are especially the Ungayara, Atukanurung, Seneca, and Tuscarora peoples. And in doing so, I recognize that this is not merely an appeal to history, but an affirmation that genocidal settler colonialism is continuing in our own time, not least in Palestine. Needless to say, we are living in very dark times. But it didn't need to be this way. There was once an idea of promise of hope, born of the universal horror of man's inhumanity to man, a vision of a world governed by the rule of law for all, rather than the exercise of force by the powerful, where all are equal under the law, a world in which the law guarantees privacy, freedom of expression, information, association, and assembly. For journalists, for publishers, for human rights defenders, for dissidents, for all of us, where arbitrary arrest and detention, torture, and abusive conditions are prohibited, and where fair trial and due process are guaranteed for all, and where healthcare, education, food, water, and sanitation are not commodities for sale to those who can afford them, but rather rights to which we are all entitled without discrimination. And most importantly, where the individual is protected from the awesome power of the state, and where colonialism, apartheid, war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, and genocide are prohibited, prevented, and opposed by the entire international community whenever and wherever they emerge. Of course, the birth certificate of this idea was registered in 1948 with the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Across the world, events were held in December to recognize its 75th anniversary. There in Australia, commemorations recalled names like Herbert Ver-Evitt, who presided over the General Assembly when the Declaration was adopted, William Roy Hodgson, who served on the commission that drafted it, and Jessie Street, the only woman in Australia's UN delegation who contributed to the drafting process as well. 75 years later, Australia's own Julian Assange has carried on the legacy of Australia's human rights defenders, but with a far greater personal sacrifice than any of these historic names. And so it is that this year, few are celebrating the birth of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Instead, today, we may well be hearing its elegy. And no natural death is this, but the result of decades of abuse by the most powerful forces on the planet, including Western governments, led by the United States, and with the full participation of the United Kingdom, many in Europe, and the State of Israel. And disturbingly, often with the complicity of major media corporations. The coming together of these forces, these governments, their militaries, their unconstrained intelligence agencies, their surveillance capacities, and the massive corporations with which they collaborate, represents a concentration of power the likes of which the world has never seen, and one that threatens to erase any hope of realizing the post-war vision of a world governed by human rights and by the rule of law. How, without checks on that power, does a journalist, a publisher, a dissident, a human rights defender, a labor union, a minority, or an occupied population stand against the abuse of that power? This, ladies and gentlemen, is not a world lighted by human rights and the rule of law. This is not the morning that the world promised after the Second World War. This is nightfall. Julian warned us, and then he became the warning. As we speak, international law is being openly flouted by these powerful actors with devastating results. For Julian Assange and other political prisoners, for thousands of innocent civilians slaughtered in Gaza, and for the continued viability of international human rights and international law themselves. Because the world is watching, and where a journalist and a publisher can be attacked and unlawfully imprisoned with impunity, and where the most serious crimes codified since the Second World War, including apartheid, war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, and genocide are openly perpetrated by Israel, not simply with the tolerance of the West, but with the active complicity of the US, the UK, and much of Europe, the same powers that have publicly collaborated in Julian's persecution and committed themselves to the cause of impunity for these crimes. There is little hope that the force of international law can long survive. Who will dare to invoke these rules in other situations, after the collective West has imperiously declared that they do not apply to the powerful states of the West or to their allies? Today, in the wake of the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a journalist is fighting for his life in Belmarsh, simply for acts of journalism. And Palestinians are losing their lives in their thousands simply for being born Palestinian. And the rest of us are losing the promise of the protections of international human rights law, international humanitarian law, international criminal law, and the UN Charter itself. Just imagine the crime of genocide, for many the most serious breach of international human rights law, carried out as we speak on a caged civilian population of 2.3 million people with the active support of Western states like the US and the UK. Genocide scholars and human rights experts have been stunned by the textbook nature of the genocide in Gaza. Israel's assault has checked every box in the UN Genocide Convention of 1948, targeting a specific ethnic group, mass killings on a horrifying scale, more than 30,000 civilians, most of them children and women, murdered in cold blood, widespread harms to children, to women, to men, intentionally denied food, water, medicine, cut down by snipers and bombs, dying of externally imposed starvation, more than 70,000 more injured, many thousands more still under the rubble, and more still dying of disease. Even before October of this year, year after year, Israel has imposed conditions of life intended to bring about the destruction of the population of Gaza through a cruel and unlawful siege. Schools, hospitals, ambulances, churches, mosques, homes, refugee camps, UN compounds, humanitarian facilities, food production, even cemeteries, all targeted. Forced transfer, collective punishment, horror. All this in the context of 75 years of ethnic purges carried out by Israel inside the Green Line, in Jerusalem, in the West Bank, and now in Gaza itself. But most remarkable of all is that the impunity afforded to Israel by the United States, the UK, and Europe has created an unprecedented situation in which the requisite genocidal intent cited by the Convention has been openly and publicly expressed by Israeli political and military leaders over and over again. No need here for investigators to dig through dusty government archives looking for evidence of genocidal intent. Typically, the most difficult element to prove in a case of genocide is intent. But in this case, so confident are they that they will not be held accountable that Israeli political and military leaders have spoken openly about their genocidal intentions, including the president, the prime minister, cabinet ministers, senior military officials, and others. They have openly dehumanized all Palestinians as animals, inhuman, terrorists, a cancer, vermin. They've declared an intent to wipe out all of Gaza, stated intention not to distinguish between civilians and combatants, expressed the need to raze Gaza to the ground, to reduce it to rubble, and to carry out another Nakba. And the prime minister himself even invoked the biblical verse on the Amalek, commanding that, quote, the entire population be wiped out, that none be spared, men, women, children, suckling babies, and livestock, end quote. In a case such as this, with such a clear and compelling prima facie manifestation of both acts of genocide and genocidal intent, if legal accountability is not pursued and secured, in addition to representing an intolerable abandonment of the victims, I fear that 8 decades of legal developments around the concept of genocide and the convention itself will also be eroded beyond compare. And let me add a final point on genocide. The convention criminalizes not only acts of genocide, but also complicity in genocide. In this case, we have seen the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and others not only failing in their prevention obligations, but also actively providing economic, military, intelligence, and diplomatic support to Israel while it is engaged in these unlawful acts in Gaza. Indeed, the US has even deployed its veto multiple times to prevent a Security Council ceasefire, after which thousands more have been killed each time. Here too, legal accountability must be pursued. But the war crimes, the crimes against humanity, the ethnic cleansing and genocide unfolding in Palestine, are not the first warning that we have received of the dismantling of human rights and the vision of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And they are not the first notice provided of the leading role of powerful Western states in this dismantling. We have seen this ruthless methodology of abuse of power deployed by these forces before. Smear, dehumanize, invoke security exceptions, brutalize, and then deny. Indeed, anyone who's been paying attention to Julian's case for the past 13 years will already know of the willingness of these states to trample on the most fundamental human rights and the rule of law itself with impunity. We know this because Julian Assange, the most important journalist of the 21st century, an award-winning publisher in the service of the public interest, dared to tell the truth about horrific US war crimes. And for this, he has faced a terrifying and unrelenting assault on his human rights, not by some dictator or street gang, but rather by the governments of the United States, the United Kingdom, and other complicit European states. Think of it. For committing the crime of journalism, Julian has been smeared, demonized, threatened with kidnapping and assassination. He's been subjected to arbitrary arrest and prolonged unlawful detention in cruel, inhuman, and degrading conditions. He's been denied his right to health in the UK and threatened with highly abusive custodial measures in the United States. And much of the world, including, shamefully, some Western media corporations, have either collaborated in this assault or stood by in complicit silence. Of course, as the guardians of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and of the binding human rights treaties based upon it, the United Nations has done far too little to address this case with the seriousness that it deserves. But thankfully, even in the face of political pressure, it has not been entirely silent in this matter. For many years now, the UN has spoken out on the unlawful persecution of Julian Assange. The UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention concluded that Julian has been arbitrarily and unlawfully detained since December of 2010. And as a matter of international law, he must be immediately freed and compensated for the harms caused to him. And the UN's Special Rapporteur on Torture found that Julian's treatment has amounted to torture in another serious violation of international human rights law. The response of the US and the UK? They simply ignored the UN's findings, and with them, the very essence of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In other words, confident of their own impunity, just as they do in Palestine, they commit their crimes against Julian out in the open. In effect, their message was, we are powerful Western states. You can't tell us what to do. And thus, they have struck one cruel blow against the humanity of Julian Assange, another against the freedom of the press, and still another against international law itself. This should be enough to mobilize all who care about justice, all who despise impunity, all who love human freedom, and who still believe in human rights. So yes, we live in dark and dangerous times, times of great insecurity and uncertainty, times of hard questions. Will the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in the framework of international law that it generated, survive these attacks by powerful Western states? Well, the answer, I believe, is up to us. If we speak up, if we demand justice, the rule of law, accountability for perpetrators, and redress for victims, if we insist on the vision promised to all of us by the Universal Declaration 75 years ago, we can turn the tide. We can turn what would have been an elegy into a celebration, if we care enough to try. But even if you still don't care about the persecution of Julian Assange for exposing US war crimes, even if you still don't care about millions of Palestinians subjected to genocide, you should take action anyway. Because if they can get away with it in Julian's case, if they can get away with it in Palestine, and they can get away with anything, anywhere, and in a post-human rights world, and without the promise of the protection of the law against abuses of state power, do not doubt for a moment that you may well be next. Still, there is hope. British courts are considering one last appeal to protect the rights of Julian Assange. And the World Court is hearing a case against Israel on genocide in Palestine. These courts may well save the framework of international law for another day. But even if they fail, listen carefully. There is a righteous rumble building in the heart of civil society, spreading out across continents, and it is growing louder each and every day. Social movements, unions, legal groups, human rights defenders, peace activists, climate defenders, all of the people in the room or online listening to this conference, and ordinary human beings of every stripe are mobilizing across the world in their millions to join the call for justice. Justice for Julian, justice for Palestine, justice for all of us. If we join them, they cannot and will not be denied. I thank you for listening, and I call for Julian to be released now. Thank you very much.